Okay, we should be live now. So let me know if the settings are bad, you can hear me, all that good stuff, because my husband changed the microphone on me. Here we go. Okay, guys, it is really, really hot today. So I'm probably going to make this quick, okay, because I am getting ready to head to Chicago to pick up a, not to pick up, I'm getting ready to head to Chicago to get on the airplane. So we have Abigail and I are going international this week. We're going to be going to London for a few days. It's going to be a very quick trip in McMurtry style. That is the way we do things. We do things cheap and we do things quick because we can't afford, 10-day trips or something. So we will be gone just till Friday, but I wanted to get this in before I left. So today's topic might be a little shorter than normal because, first of all, it's like 95 degrees in this office. That's why I have the fan on. It's like, I believe right now, 90 something outside. So we're having a huge heat wave. I think the peak is supposed to be 95 today. So that's always fun. I'm going to turn this a little so I can get some of the air. There we go. Hey, Sarah. So today might be a little bit shorter because of that. I am also stealing my husband's idea from his sermon last night, which was complicating the will of God. So that is much better. He is a much more eloquent speaker than I. You can go listen to that on his channel. It was a good sermon. But along this topic, I thought, how do women complicate God's will for our life? And I wanted to expound on this topic, but for women and single girls. I think Christians have the wrong idea about God's will. It's not some mystical, magical thing. God's will is very simple. So, what is God's will in a nutshell? All right, let's talk about that first. Well, number one, that the unsaved become saved, that everyone everywhere will yield to the call of the Holy Spirit, that they will call upon the Lord for salvation, that they will put all their trust into his finished work. So that is the will of God for every believer, for every person, he would that all men come to him. So that's the number one thing, obviously. But for believers, what is the main will of God for our lives? And my husband and I, this is not something new that we have come up with. We have seen throughout the years people who try to complicate God's will. Like if God, and even as far as going, if I don't get a sign that this is God's will, I'm not doing it. And it could be for something simple as moving, getting a new job, whatever it may be, even going, if you're single, going after someone else as far as like pursuing a relationship. Like they want all of these pieces to fall into place and they almost want these signs, kind of how the Jews sought after signs. And that's kind of how people get with this. They kind of turn it into this like mystical thing that's super hard for anyone to find, and if you find it, you better stay exactly where you are and not make one wrong choice, otherwise you're going to be completely out of God's will. And I think a lot of this is due to bad preaching, maybe growing up as a teenager. I heard constantly, you don't want to get out of God's will, you don't want to get out of God's will, you need to find God's perfect will for your life. And they made it sound like it was some treasure hunt and that you'd be really lucky if you found it, but good luck because it was pretty hard to find. And that's not the case at all. God's will is actually very simple and it's very easy for believers because honestly, we only have a few things that we need to do as believers. Number one, if we love God, everything else is going to fall into place because if we love God, we're going to have a hard time getting out of God's will because God's will for a believer is that, he gives us some commandments in the Bible, but the Bible also talks about if we love him, we will do those lesser things even. And those lesser things could be, church attendance, staying faithful to him, trying to keep sin out of our lives, soul winning, those could be some of those things. So number one, as a believer, the will of God is that you love him. If you love him, lots of stuff is going to fall into place. Number two, that you love others. And all the law and the prophets hang on those two commands, love God, love others, because if we love others, that's going to eliminate most of the sin. we love others, we're not going to murder them. If we love others, we're not going to try to rip them off. If we love others, we're not going to freak out on them. If we love others, we're not going to do anything to harm them. So love God, love others. We love God. That kind of puts everything into place as far as following his commandments, the 10 commandments. We love others. That also plays into it. If we love others, we're not going to, commit infidelity or fornication because we're putting their needs above ours. We're putting our spouse's needs above ours. So, all those things are going to fall in place if we just do those two things. So that's God's will for believers. And then just having the fruits of the Spirit. I can't remember what passage he read, but it was just talking about having those things in our lives. Love, joy, peace, long suffering, all of those things. That's God's will. So what are some ways that single people complicate God's will? Okay, so if you're single, this part's for you. So, angels are not going to announce if your soulmate has come on the scene. So stop sitting around looking for a blimp to go across the sky with a big sign saying you have found who your heart desires. No, sometimes it's by trial and error. That's why you get to know people. Sometimes you talk to people to see if you want to pursue a deeper relationship. And you have a choice in that. We don't believe, as Baptists, in arranged marriages. We believe in vetting the guy out or vetting the girl out. If there's major red flags, you don't have to pursue it any longer. Do you like him and does he like you? Those are two of the biggest things that you have to look at. You have a will in this thing. No one's forcing you to be with someone. No one's forcing them to be with you. So are you attracted to him? These are very simple things, but you would be surprised at how people overcomplicate this issue of finding a spouse. And you might say, well, I don't want to get stuck with the dud. Marriage is so important and I realize it's for life. And this is my philosophy when it comes to relationships and marriage. I have told my kids often, I do believe that most people can make it work if they are truly good people. Okay. If you have a good Christian guy who loves the Lord and wants to stay faithful to the things of the Lord and the Lord, you'll make it work. If you have a good Christian girl who loves the Lord and wants to stay faithful to the Lord and love the Lord, she'll make it work. So I do think, not dependent on any personality test or anything like that, I do think that two people can definitely make it work. But you need to count all these things in. Don't go after someone that you find hideously ugly, And yes, looks aren't everything, but you still need to be attracted to who you married. You're going to be with them for a long time. You're going to have a physical relationship with them for a long time. And if you shudder at the thought of them kissing you or touching you, then don't go for them. It's as simple as that. Is he red flag free? The whole purpose of talking to someone, getting to know them, the dating relationship. Lots of people and lots of homeschoolers have coined the term courtship. We do something similar, but I don't call it courtship because that just puts this like weird arranged marriage vibe into people's heads. And obviously I don't believe in arranged marriages at all. So we call it dating, but we call it Baptist dating. Okay. So my husband calls it prison dating. That's what he calls it. Because basically we don't believe in fornication. We believe in saving the physical relationship for marriage. And so we have chaperones. Now for us, we're pretty loose with this. We don't have to be on the date with them. As long as usually about 10 and up, they can chaperone. If kids are going to find a way to sin, if my 21-year-old is going to find a way to sin, if he wants to sin, he's going to find a way to sin. It doesn't matter who we send with him on the date. Both him and his girlfriend are adults and they'll find a way to sin if it's in their heart. So the chaperone is just more there for accountability. It's not like a guarantee. And I've tried explaining that to parents. It's not a guarantee. It's just a safeguard. My husband and I put safeguards into our marriage. We're not alone with anyone of the opposite sex. He's not alone here in the building with anyone, et cetera, et cetera. So that being said, we don't call it courtship, we call it dating. And the whole reason that there is a dating process of getting to know them is so that if there are any red flags that they feel they cannot live with, then they are able to end that before marriage, because marriage is a vow before God, and it is to be taken very seriously. So can you just live with him? Like, I can put up with him, or can you not live without him? That's another thing I like to ask those in relationships. Are you just putting up with him? Or, sorry, this microphone is all over because my husband took it off he has a new setup. So this is very tipsy topsy. I ask my daughters, is it just someone that you're putting up with? Or can you not envision your life without him? Because after you get married, you're going to have ups and downs, and you're in it for, through thick and thin. And so you're going to need to decide that if there's any major red flag issues, it needs to be over now, earlier rather than later. It's okay to ask God for your desires. If you're single, it's okay to ask for God to send a spouse into your life. I'm not one of these who believes that you're either destined to be married or you're destined to be single. We have a choice in this. Okay. God's not going to just drop someone in your lap while you're sitting there, unless most of the time you pursue it, especially if you're a guy. So I'm not one who thinks that, you just like get faithful in your church and then God's just going to like send someone through the door. Sometimes you have to go looking, and it's okay to go searching for those desires. So if you're a man, go to where the women are, which might be visiting different churches, different Baptist churches. It might be going to Bible college. It might be going to conferences where you think like-minded women would be. It's okay to go searching for those things. It's okay to pursue those desires as long as they're not going to make you sin. So if you can do it and keep your relationship pure with whoever you end up with, it's not a sin. There are some things that are not sins, yet people make them into sins. And I call this being over the top. Being over the top is when you make grievous burdens for others to bear that, number one, you haven't been through yet. So let's say that you have just this over the top expectation when it comes to female male relationships. Okay. So whether that's you should never text a member of the opposite sex unless you're married. So if you haven't had, and that's how you date, like you only talk in public to each other, there's too much, temptation. This is just very extreme. I don't know anyone who does this, but I'm just being extreme for the sake of being extreme. You only see them in public. That's the only time that you communicate. That way you're just eliminating all temptation in your life. Well, if you didn't do it that way and you haven't had any teenagers that have gone through it, I would be careful making over the top suggestions. Okay. So I actually have had some kids in dating relationships, going through dating relationships close to, engagement and getting married. I have one married. It's actually his 1-year anniversary today, Tommy and Jenna. So I've had some that have gone through that. I myself went through that. So we have tried to with our kids from the time that they were little. We have been very careful when they were little, making over the top, pounding our chest, over the top declarations for our family. Because one of two things are going to happen. One, you're going to feel like you need to stick with that when your kids become teenagers and you figure out, wow, I was really extreme and this isn't going to work, but I already pounded my chest and, everyone knows I feel this way. So now I have to stick with it. And you're going to have to back down on that and look like a compromiser. Or number two, your kids are just going to completely rebel because it's unattainable. You didn't do it. No one's done it in the history of being a Baptist, but you somehow think that you're the exception and you're so spiritual that you're going to be over the top when it comes to this. So we have to be careful with making things into sins that are not sins. And some of those things can include Bible college. Bible college is not a sin. Bible college is not for everyone, but let's not make it into a sin. It's not a sin if you go to Bible college. You're not breaking any of God's commandments. You're not breaking any laws. You're going there literally to learn about the Bible. And especially if it's a good IFB, King James only, separated, soul winning college, you're not sinning if you go to Bible college. Pursuing higher education, let's not make that into a sin. As long as all the parents are on board and you're not rebelling in any way, that's not a sin. Friendships with those of the opposite sex, as long as you keep them pure, that in and of itself is not a sin. So you need to be careful making that into a sin. And then getting a job, even as a girl, as a guy, whatever it is, as long as your parents are on board, that's not a sin. And we need to be careful demonizing occupations and jobs and different things like that. We're supposed to be in the world, but not of the world. Just a second here. Sorry, answering something in the group chat with my family. Okay. So yes, let's be careful making things into sins that are not sins. Let's be careful beating our chest when our kids are real little and we have no idea and we've never been through it. We've never done it that way. Our kids have never done it that way. What are some ways that women complicate God's will? So what is God's will for married women? And this is pretty easy too. Okay. So we need to put God first. Now, there are a bunch of verses to go with this. I don't want to like act like I'm preaching a sermon. So definitely look up the verses about I would that the younger women marry. Those verses, we all know them. That's God's will for women. God first, obeying his commandments, loving him. If we love God and we love others, pretty much all of these are going to fall in place once again. So God first, husband next, the kids after. Okay, so those three things. And then the home next. I would put the home as number 4. If your home is a little bit messy, but you are, loving your husband well, loving your kids well, training them up, then, you need to stop feeling so much mom guilt, honestly. Now, part of keeping the home clean might be that your husband likes the home clean. So if your husband likes the home clean, it's good to get on that and get it done. But most of it, husbands are going to be understanding when you've got a whole pack of children, especially if you're having children all the time. You have a whole pack of children, most husbands are going to be pretty understanding. Following the husband, submitting to the husband, reverencing the husband, those are all God's will for our life. As much as it's not socially acceptable, and as much as I am against toxic patriarchy, I am all for biblical patriarchy, which, there has to be someone who makes the final decision in things in the home, is the leader of the home. So that's the biblical model. Not being a busybody. It is God's will that you're not a busybody. And there are different verses in the Bible that talk about not being idle, not going from house to house. Back in the Bible days, obviously, women would probably literally go from house to house. Nowadays, it's a little bit harder, especially if we're kind of all spread out, like even my church friends here, we're all kind of spread out. My best friends live pretty far away from me, 5 hours one way, 8 or 9 hours the other way. So they live pretty far away, but we definitely can be a busybody through this thing right here. We can definitely be a busybody through that phone. We can go house to house. We can get involved in things that aren't ours to get involved in. And with that comes worrying about other people's family and not your own. So it's obviously God's will that you focus on your own family and your own husband and don't worry about what other people say or think about you. I've really had to learn that being in the ministry. Sometimes you live in a glass house and people think that they are qualified or it is their job to maybe try to run your marriage the way that their marriage is run. And yes, people have tried that. Try to run your kids the way they run their kids. And yes, people have tried that. And, for pastors' wives out there, you just kind of got to put your foot down and say, thank you for your concern, but this is my family and my problem. It's not your problem, not your job to worry about me and my husband, not your job to worry about me and my kids. So you kind of got to put your foot down sometimes. Okay, so the phrase, we are praying about it. And this is a phrase that is said very often when people are getting ready to make a decision that deep down they know is not the best, whether that's switching jobs, maybe that's, moving states because the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. There's that whole phrase, we're praying about it. And my husband mentioned this in a sermon. It is a power play. Okay. So when you say I'm praying about it, and I'm just going to hold this so I can sit back for a minute. When you say I'm praying about it, that is a power play because as soon as those words come out of your mouth, no one can say anything about your decision. Because who are they to question whether or not you really prayed about it? Or who are they to question God's will? Once again, the mystical God's will that is to be found. You're probably doing God's will exactly where you're at. So I don't think if you're in a good local church, good local IFB soul winning church, it's going to be God's will for you to, move around the world to go to Scotland to another IFB church, unless you're a missionary or something. So we're praying about it. People say it, usually said to condone a bad decision, because you can't really respond to that. There's no response to what we prayed about it, and this is God's will for our life. We prayed about it, and this is what we're going to do. So you can't argue. Discussion closed. People usually do that who don't want to hear any they don't want to hear anything contrary to their decision, because most people, when they make decisions, they've made them up. They don't go for counsel, or if they go for counsel, they're looking for affirmation for their decision. They're not looking for someone to actually change their mind on it. So usually it's said just to condone a bad decision. If it's a sin, God's not going to give you his okay. So if you say, I've been praying about leaving my wife, she's a bitter, old, nagging hag, and I can't stand her, and I think it's God's will that I dump her and move on to this, Jezebel who's 20 years younger and, in the prime of her life, and she's not a nag. That's not God's will for you to ever do that. It's not God's will for you to dump your spouse and go for someone else. That's not God's will. If it's a sin, God's not going to give you his okay. So what are some things that are sin, first of all, that would not be God's will, no matter how many times you say, I think this is God's will? Well, obviously, divorcing your wife or spouse or someone better, getting out of church to make more money. That's never going to be God's will if you're completely, because the Bible literally says, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, and so much more as you see the day approaching. So getting out of church completely to make more money, you're breaking one of the commandments. That's not going to be God's will for that to happen. Discontentment. Discontentment is definitely a sin. There's verses in the Bible talking about, being content. And so if you're discontent over the way things are in your life, and that causes you to make decisions, moving, taking a better job, that's going to limit your time with your family, different things like that I would put that in the category of sin if you're just discontent and never happy where you are. We've heard stories of, people that have just had to move to the state. They had to move to Colorado because the mountains are beautiful there. They moved there, they lived there for 30 years, and they end up moving back to Illinois because it's not about where you live. But even after they move back to Illinois, then it's, oh, I miss Colorado. So it's not about where you live. It's not about the state. And I'm so sick of Illinois getting a bad rap, because it's a great place. I've written several blog posts about it, but you make life into what you want it to be. You make your life beautiful, or you can be stuck in the state of discontent and constantly want something more and constantly want something better. And usually women struggle the most with this. I would say men are pretty content as long as they have a wife who loves him. They have kids who love him. They have a solid home to come home to every night. They have a wife who looks after their needs. Men are pretty easy to please. Now, I've seen the discontentment bug bite men for sure. I'm not saying it never happens, but as the wife, we play a lot into this. If you're constantly nagging your husband because you hate the state you live in, that you hate the church you go to, everyone gets on your nerves, everyone's annoying, everyone has problems, and we all have problems. You're constantly nagging at him. He's going to just want peace. And so that's usually when the husbands will try to do something drastic to please their wives, but they find out usually between 3 and 5 years, that's the cycle. 3 to 5 years later, they're right back to complaining, right back to hating everyone, right back to hating where they live, right back to hating the church. So it's not about the state that you live in. It's not about the church that you go to. It's a matter of the heart is what it is. It's a matter of the heart. So another thing that could be a sin is coveting others' things. It's okay to get a bass boat if you can afford it. It's okay to have a nice home. It's okay to have things that are in this world. But it's not okay when it becomes to coveting, when you take something that's not yours, when you take someone's spouse, when you steal someone's property, that's not okay. That's when it becomes a sin. Another thing that could be a sin is neglecting your responsibility to pursue other things or getting money to make money, different things like that. Or another thing that could be a sin is sowing discord in a church so that you have an excuse to leave. You don't really have an excuse. They're preaching the right doctrine, they're soul winning, they're King James. You don't really have an excuse to go. But if you cause some problems, sit back and watch the show, then maybe it'll all fall apart and you'll have an excuse to go. I've seen it happen in ours. So it definitely happens. But what are some things that, let's see, what are some things that aren't a sin, but people complicate? Kate. So, moving, you can move where you want. It's okay to, prefer mountains over farmland, or it's okay to prefer beaches over mountains or whatever. It's not like God's in heaven saying you have to live here. For me personally, I don't think I'm ever going to go anywhere just because all of our kids are marrying people from Illinois. We have very deep roots, and I firmly believe in planting roots wherever you are, planting roots. And people just don't know, especially Americans, we don't know how to plant roots anymore. So we usually go to a place for 5 years at the max, and then we look to move on. Well, this wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I'm going to move on. 5 years later, this wasn't what I thought it was going to be. I'm going to move on. And so on and so forth. But that being said, it's okay. You can move to what state you want. Getting a better job is not a sin as long as it doesn't keep you from serving God and being faithful. There's nothing wrong with that. Earning money is not a sin. It's not a sin to earn money as long as you are a wise steward with that. You're not doing anything sinful with it, such as, drugs, alcohol, whatever, anything illegal. Enjoying God's creation is not a sin. Going on a trip is not a sin. Don't let anyone ever make you feel guilty for it. If you work hard and you save up, that's exactly what I'm doing this week. Work hard, save up, don't go into debt for it, then you can feel good enjoying that. I believe God's creation was meant to be enjoyed. Different parts of the world were meant to be enjoyed. And it might not be your season for that. So don't get discontent when you're in a non-traveling season. But also, it's okay if you are in the traveling season not to feel guilty over that. Okay, so, but at the end of the day, God wants us to have the desires of our heart. If you want something, go for it. It's not this magic, mystical, mysterious, I don't know if this is God's will nonsense. Please pray for all the pieces to fall into place so I can know it's God's will. Sometimes when we want to make something happen, it takes work. Okay. So let me just kind of go over 13 years ago. It's almost 13 years in 2 weeks. It'll be 13 years. 13 years ago, my husband decided he wanted to plant a church in Sterling Rock Falls. Now, we could have picked anywhere. We could have picked Indiana. We could have picked anywhere in the Midwest. We could have picked, New York if we wanted. We could have picked California. We could have picked Montana. We could have picked anywhere we want. But because we have family here in Illinois and all of our family lived there, my mom still lived here back then, my sisters, his family, I think they all still live in Illinois. We have roots here. This is where we're from. We're from farmland country. We're from rural country. We love Illinois. We always will. Illinois gets way too much undeserved hate, in my opinion. We love it. It's green. It's luscious. I love my cornfields, whatever. So we decided to plant a church in Illinois, only about an hour from our sending church. Everything did not fall into place for that. First of all, when we went to go look into buying a home, we had zero credit because we had followed Dave Ramsey and we had paid off all our debt. So we had been debt free for 1 or 2 years at the time. And we had zero. Our credit was literally zero. So we were told you cannot buy a home. Okay. So some people would have been like, that's it. God's will, mystical God's will has spoken. We are not supposed to move here because we can't buy a house. That's hogwash. We looked until we found a house to rent. Now, the rent was too high for us. It was, I believe, $1,000 a month. And we said, there's no way we can do that. There's no way we can do that. Or it was 800. I think back then it was 800 a month. We said, there's no way we can do that. So I called the lady. We had looked at the house. She loved us. She loved our family. She knew he was coming here to plant a church. And we told her, we said, and we're sorry, 800 or 850, whatever it is. It's just too high. This was, almost 13 years ago. So the rate of living was lower. And she said, okay, I understand. And that was that. So strike two, right? This house that we loved, right where we needed it to be, was too far out of our price range. Nothing was really available then. And we would have been like, that's it. God's mystical will. We're not supposed to move there. We can't find a house to buy. We're not able to buy a house to buy. We're not able to buy a house. We're not able, this rental fell through. What are we going to do now? So about 2 or 3 days later, she called back and she said, I loved your family. I have a really good feeling about you. Would you rent it if I gave it to you for $600 a month? And we said, yes, of course we will. We will rent it for $600 a month. So that worked out. But we moved into the house. We were only there a year while we built up our credit. We actually got a credit card. We might have gotten a van payment, whatever. So my father-in-law of our sending church, him and the church decided to pay us for 6 months of salary while we tried to get the church up and running. And we were like, okay, that's great. You'll have a job in 6 months. No problem. Of course, we thought we were going to hit 100 within the first year and he'd be full-time, right? Ha, that's hilarious. He didn't go full-time till almost 9 years later. That's another story for another day. But we were like, okay, no problem. 6 months, you'll be able to find a job. Those 6 months flew, and he pounded the pavement every single day, out knocking doors, working on sermons, trying to get people in the church. At the end of the first year, we probably had 20, 30 people, something like that. But 6 months later, he started applying for jobs probably 3 months, 2 or 3 months into the 6 month period. Nothing. He could not find anything. He was applying. It was a very scary time, but we went for about a month with zero income. So our credit card was coming in handy then. So that is the one time in our marriage we've had to, because he did not have a job, we've had to go on public assistance for food. That is the only time in our marriage we have had to. And that's what it's there, for temporary, if you don't have a job or you're laid off or something like that. But that was a scary time. So 6 months into it, all these things have happened now. Not all the pieces fell into place. We had to aggressively make things happen for this to happen. It does not mean it was not the will of God. It means that if you want to make something happen, sometimes it takes work. God's not going to do all the work for you when it comes to any area of life, when it comes to planting the church, when it comes to finding a good spouse, when it comes to having a good marriage. God's not going to wave his hands in heaven. That's not how this works. We're not Calvinists. We don't think that just like we're puppets, where God's just controlling us with the little, wooden stakes or whatever. No, sometimes you have to make things happen. So 6 months into it, he's trying hard to find a job. He finally did get on at Walmart Distribution Center, but even then was hard. For the next 9 months, he worked night and day. Finally, after he goes full time, about 9 years into it, a year after he goes, or the same year that he went full time, COVID hit. And then all this stuff starts happening with like the church and not knowing, are they going to shut us down? All this stuff is going on. And then about a year or two into COVID, we had our first church split. So at that point, it would have been easy just to say, this isn't worth it. This is too hard. Maybe this isn't God's will, 11 years in. Maybe this isn't God's will. That's silly. We know this entire time we have been in God's will by the fact that we're doing what we know God wants us to do. We're in church. My husband's preaching the truth. We're, we have the convictions and standards that we believe God wants in our lives. We're right where he wants us. And it doesn't matter if you're running a church of 500 or you're running a church of 50. If you're in the middle of God's will, God is going to bless you. And I've seen it. I've seen God blessing. I've seen him blessing in the lives of my children and in the people that he's brought into my children's lives. As far as relationships and friendships go, I've seen my children flourish. I've seen, and it all comes down to just faithfulness, having grit, having faithfulness. The kids are unsung heroes a lot of times of things that we go through in our life, especially when it comes to church planting. Because when we started church planting, it was just our family. And God has blessed with every step of the way, and they've seen it. They've seen their dad's faithfulness. They've seen us go through hard times and stick it out. They've seen that we're content right where God has put us in Illinois. I don't know why that's such a bad thing, but they've seen that, you know, God's hand is in this thing through the people that have been saved, the lives that have been reached, the people that have been changed. Illinois needs good churches too. And if we had this mindset that we have to move to the perfect state that has the perfect laws, which I will say Illinois has the best homeschooling laws of the entire nation. So if you are looking to homeschool, Illinois has good homeschooling laws. There's not a Garden of Eden. This entire world is sin. It's full of sin. It's full of decay. It's full of death. And you can flourish if you are in Saudi Arabia. You can flourish if you are in Illinois. You can flourish if you are in Pakistan. You can flourish if you are in Russia. Wherever you are, wherever God has you, you can flourish. So it's not this magical, mystical thing that you have to find like a treasure map. If I don't move here, it's not God's will. If I don't move out of here, it's not God's will, you know? But starting up an online academy with my online academy, same thing. There were some situations around that with the arts academy where it didn't work out and it was during COVID. And, you know, I decided to start it's a lot of work. I'm just saying everything in life is work. And just because all the pieces don't fall into place, we usually make things happen that we want to happen. Okay. So it's not this magical, mystical thing where if this doesn't happen, it's not God's will. Are you, when you're seeking to do something, are you still in God's will? Are you loving him? Are you loving others? Are you obeying his commandments? And are you not sinning? Then if you're doing all of those, you're in God's will. Okay. Sometimes bad things happen and we need to stop being so superstitious that we were out of God's will and that's why it happened. Anytime something is going crazy in my life, I take a good hard look at myself and I say, is it I, Lord? I want to be sensitive to the leading of the Holy Spirit. But most of us know if we are in grievous sin and God is chastening, and most of us know if we are doing our best, following God, loving him, doing his commandments, and just sometimes bad things happen. We live in a sin-sick world, and the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous. So bad things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. Sometimes things just happen badly. I just heard of this as I'm getting ready to go on a plane. I just heard of this group of gospel singers. I believe their plane crashed and like all five or six of them died. Were they out of God's will? I doubt it. I know they were actively trying to serve the Lord, you know, but that's not even our call to make. Be very, very careful looking at other people's lives and trying to make a judgment call. Baptists love to call down Baptist curses on others, and it's really a shame. We should never get into that mindset. You can only look at your life and decide if you're in sin or if you're doing okay. You can only look at your life. Don't look at other people's lives and make that judgment call because you have no idea. If you're not actively sinning, the chances are God isn't sitting in heaven throwing lightning bolts your way. I know Baptists think that they can throw down curses on people, but that's not the way this works. We should never judge another person's situation and call down curses. And maybe life just happens. When we change some of our positions on different things that my husband was seeing very clear in the Bible, he had Baptist preachers tell him in the Baptist form of calling down curses, I'm going to pray for you, brother. I'm going to pray that nothing terrible happens to you, that nothing terrible happens to your wife, that nothing terrible happens to your kids. I'm going to pray for you. I am so glad God's hand of protection was on us during the first 4 or 5 years after that happened, because I can't help but think that they would have been sitting back and patting themselves on the shoulder if, God forbid, one of my children died or something terrible happened. One of them got cancer or got really sick or I got really sick. Because they would have been like, oh, my prayers didn't work. I told him he's going down a dark path and this was going to happen to him. You know, I'm very glad God protected us, just because I know there would have been Baptists out there saying that old Tommy McMurtry, he went down that path and look what happened to his family. Well, on the flip side, fires happen to Baptists all the time. Cancer happens to Baptists all the time. And if you're in the club, they would never say something like, oh, he was going down that dark path and that's why. No, they would never say something like that if you're in the club. But if you're out of the club, they like to call down those curses. And I think it's ridiculous. I think it's asinine. And I wish Baptists would stop doing that because it's super superstitious to the core. And we're not supposed to be superstitious or heed to wives like fables or different things like that. And the Bible specifically says, judge not lest you be judged. And the judgment that it's talking about here is that it's, oh, if that person didn't tithe, and that's why their car broke down. Be careful saying that because if you skip your tithe, God might curse you with that same thing. Oh, that person, they did this sin and that's why this is happening. Well, you better be careful ever doing that sin then because God will produce that same thing in your life. So we need to be careful. I think the best thing is just stop looking at other people and stop trying to judge situations that are not yours to judge and judge your own heart, judge your own life. And most of the time we know we're like the kid that gets caught with his hand in the cookie jar. We know if we're sinning or not. We know if we're, striving to please God. And if something bad happens when you're in God's will and you're truly doing your best as a Christian, just chalk it up to this world stinks. I mean, life sometimes just stinks. And there's no other way around it. Bad people have bills, good people have bills. Bad people have their car break down, good people have their car break down. Bad people get cancer, good people get cancer. It's not so cut and dry all the time. So just because we live in a sin sick world. Anyways, I am dying of heat exhaustion in here. I am sweating so badly. I feel bad because I'm about to get on a plane. I'm going to be a sweaty mess, but I think everyone in Chicago is going to be a sweaty mess today because it's almost 100 degrees. So I'm going to let you go. Pray for us and, pray that our plane won't crash into which way are we going? Atlantic. I had to think about it. We went over the Pacific for Hawaii. We're going over the Atlantic, so pray that everything goes smoothly. I've gotten better with plane rides, but I don't feel comfortable with the majority of it being over the ocean. That kind of still freaks me out a little bit. Anything domestically, I'm fine with. Like, to me, it's the same as getting on a bus, but over the ocean, it still makes me a little nervous. So anyways, pray for us. If you follow me on social media, I'm sure you will be seeing lots and lots of pictures. So we will see you guys next week, Lord willing that we are back and safe. So I'll see you guys then. Have a great week.